Hey guys, Eric here with ADHD Go Week 1. This is the basics module of the course. And in this module, we're going to discuss what ADHD is so you can understand the condition a little bit better, how it affects your life, and a little bit about what you can start to do to manage your symptoms. It's going to help you be a little bit more secure in your identity, treat yourself with more compassion, and move toward greater self-fulfillment. So before we begin, let's start off with a few disclaimers, and I'll briefly discuss the webinar format as well. Right off the bat, I am not a medical professional. I am not here to diagnose you or prescribe you anything. I'm also not a therapist. I'm not going to help you with your past traumas or any emotional concerns that you might have. I'm here as an ADHD advocate and a guide who's going to help you to find your own inner coach. So to do that, I'm going to present you with treatment tactics and a strategy that works that you can then incorporate into your own life in a way that works best for you. I'm also going to be here to answer any questions that you have about ADHD or your own treatment. You can email me those questions at questions@adhdgo.com. Please try to do that ahead of time. The more lead time you give me, the better response I can get back to you. Also, pop your questions into the chat if you like, and I will try to get those as we have time at the end of the webinar. These webinars are going to run about an hour. Some of them will go a little bit under. This one might go a little bit long because we've got a lot to cover. We'll review the course material from the last week. I'll go into a little bit more detail on those concepts. And then at the end, as I mentioned, we'll have question and answer time before talking about what we're going to be doing next week. So with that out of the way, let's get started. So the first part about your ADHD treatment that I think is important to kind of use as a jumping off point is to consider how you first learned about ADHD. When did the concept of ADHD first enter your awareness, and what were the circumstances around that? Further, when did you first suspect that ADHD might affect your life? Identifying your condition and learning to accept yourself is really tied to a lot of these first conceptions and prejudices that you might have had about ADHD. For example, when I first was learning that people had ADHD and what it was, I had a very negative opinion about those people, the condition, their abilities. And even though those things resonated with my own experience and sort of paralleled a lot of what was going on in my own life, I still judged those things very harshly and had a lot of misconceptions that I wasn't aware of and sort of took for granted. And I think it's important to recognize that whatever we feel uncomfortable with about ourselves is often something that we project onto other people. So if we hate something in somebody else, it's best to look at what we're doing and our own behaviors and see if maybe that's reflected, and that's the reason why it really gets under our skin, whatever it is. If it's disorganization, if it's timeliness, those things are things that you're going to have to learn to love about yourself, and it can be helpful to love that in someone else first and learn to forgive them. It doesn't matter which order you do that in, but compassion is going to be so critical for you to take positive steps in your treatment and in improving your life outcomes. Compassion is a key component in really relieving your stress and forgiving yourself for the mistakes that you will inevitably make as you go forward on this treatment journey. So definitely ask yourself the question, when I learn that someone is diagnosed with ADHD, I assume blank, and fill in the rest of the statement so that you can understand what your preconceptions about ADHD might be. And as far as how you know whether ADHD is a part of your identity, right now it's enough that you suspect it might be, because this course is going to help you regardless of whether you actually have a diagnosable condition like ADHD or not. These concepts are helpful for everyone, but it's definitely geared for those of us with ADHD. Um, so a lot of these preconceptions that you might have about ADHD, and a lot of the things that people tend to believe who aren't really familiar on a personal level with this condition, come from myths and bad information, sort of these reductive statements that come back again and again about people with ADHD. And some of those terms are here on the right, and they are kind of hurtful, reductive labels that people use, which form the basis of a lot of these harmful myths. But it's important to remember that these beliefs are based in real experiences that arise from symptoms. So these myths come from problems that those of us with ADHD actually encounter. For instance, we have trouble organizing and activating for tasks. We have trouble sustaining and shifting our focus, paying attention to details. Sometimes we get overwhelmed by our emotions. Sometimes it's a struggle to remember things we were told. So a lot of those problems end up being reduced to something that's wrong with the person and not a symptom that they're dealing with. And that's really hurtful, and it makes us feel like we are the condition rather than a person with a condition. So in order to overcome a lot of that hurt and the stress that creates, it's important that we just do whatever we can to reduce that stress. And in so doing, you'll become more aware of your desires, and you'll be able to start taking steps in the right direction. And as you do that and you celebrate small victories and become attentive to the progress that you're making, you'll start to build more and more confidence and strengthen your resilience. And that's going to become a self-reinforcing cycle. As far as the steps that you take towards your big goals, you don't need to overthink that at this point. The important thing is to just appreciate what you are doing. Congratulate yourself for the fact that you became aware of the problems your symptoms were causing, and now you're taking an action. You're at this course. You're listening to me right now. And that's a huge step. That's going to make all the difference in improving your overall life outcomes. Before we move on, I think it's important to just define a couple of my terms. The word neurotypical sort of defines this concept of someone who has no particularly unique aspects to their thought processes and their patterns of behavior based on the structure and neurochemistry of their brain. An atypical, on the other hand, does have some unique differences to this neurotypical brain. This can be defined in a lot of different ways, but ADHD is definitely a part of that sort of large category. And I find it to be a useful term to differentiate us from this kind of illusory, fuzzy idea of normal. And I don't mean that we're abnormal. We're special. And I don't mean that in a negative way either. What I mean is, a neurotypical brain doesn't actually exist. A lot of atypicals start to feel like a sense of grief or longing to be neurotypical, but that's like a horse wishing to be a unicorn. Really, a unicorn doesn't exist, and the same is true of a neurotypical brain or a neurotypical person. We all have something. Atypicals just happen to have something that has a definite name, clear symptoms and ways to manage those symptoms. So in a lot of ways, we're actually lucky. And so don't get too caught up in grieving the fact that you're not neurotypical, because again, that's kind of an absurd concept to start with, but it does provide a nice contrast to the unique aspects of our own thought processes as people with ADHD. So I'll use the term atypicals to talk about people with ADHD pretty often or commonly going forward. Okay, so let's talk about what ADHD is. There's two parts of the title. The ampersand here is mine. Sometimes there's a slash, or sometimes people just lump it all together, but attention deficit and hyperactive disorder. So the two parts are attention deficit and hyperactive disorder, obviously, and then there's a third, which is both of those together. And these represent the three subtypes that are generally recognized within the ADHD classification. So the first part is inattentive type of ADHD. The second part is obviously the hyperactive type of ADHD, and the third is combined, where you're both inattentive and hyperactive. So for me, for example, I tend to consider myself an inattentive subtype of ADHD because I don't really exhibit a lot of those physically hyperactive characteristics. Part of that is just because I'm a little older. I was a little bit more of a hyperactive child. So I don't think that these definitions, these rigid sort of definitions, really fit to define atypicals as well. I think it's a little bit outdated, and we certainly could use a new label for the symptom group that we exhibit, but we're working with what we got. So what are the main symptoms of ADHD? I break it down into three main symptom categories. There's contextual attention, impaired executive function, and hyperactivity. We'll also talk about 4 other subsymptoms of ADHD, which are rejection sensitive dysphoria, oppositional defiant disorder, time issues, and memory impairments. And like I said, those are subsymptoms of each of the main symptoms, but I think they're unique enough that they're worth mentioning on their own. So let's look at the first symptom, the first main symptom, which is contextual attention. So with ADHD, it's important to remember that this is a condition of extremes. You're either on or you're off. Neurotypicals sort of have like fader dials, right, for their attention, for instance, where certain things they can dial up how much attention they pay to those things or dial it down on everything that comes into their head. Whereas people with ADHD, we tend to be paying attention to something and only that thing or not. So there's no focus, which is when the switch is off. And this is when you are incapable of focusing on a task or engaging with it. You're just simply not interested in that thing. And so you find yourself daydreaming, avoiding that task however you can. Then the on portion of that switch is when you do find something that interests you and you become focused on it at the expense of everything else. Everything else in your life fades away and you become solely focused on this. You forget important obligations. You show up late or not at all. You forget to eat. You forget to go to the bathroom. You're completely focused on this single task. So then the third one, scattered focus, is similar to no focus. I just call attention to it because it's another way that we have of becoming paralyzed in a kind of non-engaged state, but in a way we're also hyper-engaged because our mind is ping-ponging around to every stimuli that enters into our awareness. And that's a big part of ADHD. You hear a dog barking outside, you smell cookies, the lights flicker, you feel some kind of emotion or a memory triggers something in your head, and suddenly that becomes the main priority for that moment. rather than the task that you're supposed to be, that you feel like you ought to be concentrating on. Whatever is happening to us, whatever captures our attention in the present moment, especially if it's new, tends to become our priority. It's like a flashing light that it's just impossible to ignore. And so scattered focus is when we're sort of in that paralyzed state and we're just going around to every possible stimuli that's entered our awareness at that moment. The next big symptom is impaired executive function. And these are aspects of the skills required to organize and execute a task. So I'll go through the components of, or the definitions of the 6 that I have listed here, and those all make up this sort of concept of executive function. So the first one is activation, which is just organizing, prioritizing, and starting the work. This has a lot to do with the planning process. The second one is focus, which is obviously sustaining and shifting your attention while you work on a task. The next is effort, which really comes down to regulating your alertness. A lot of us can get a little drowsy if a task isn't really engaging us. So we need to be able to sustain the effort that we put into something and the speed at which we accomplish it. The next one here is emotion. Obviously, emotions can really derail us when we're trying to work on pretty much any task. The big one is managing our frustration, but it could be any emotion. We tend to easily get frustrated though, and that can cause us to abandon what we were doing or not finish. The next one is memory, and so that just comes down to utilizing your working memory, recalling information about what's required to finish a task. And the last one is action, which is just monitoring and self-regulating whatever the physical actions are required to complete the task. So atypicals tend to struggle with some part of each of those bits of executive function when trying to complete a task, and so those are things that we'll address when we get to the treatments portion. And the last main symptom is hyperactivity, and this one gives a lot of misconceptions to what ADHD is. There tends to be this stereotype about ADHD that it's a kid who can't sit still in a classroom, and that's what hyperactivity is, and that typifies ADHD. But the truth is, it's not a physical hyperactivity that is really the main symptom here. It's a hyperactive mind, and that does manifest in sort of a physical restlessness often, but it also extends to hypersensitivity, the feeling of my shirt. Like I said, a noise outside, lights flickering, a smell in the room, all of those things seem to be really heightened and take priority in our mind. That leads to hyperactive thoughts. We're picking these things apart, analyzing them from every possible angle. Then hyperactive emotions. Anytime we have an emotion stirred up inside us, again, we focus on that, we latch onto it, we feel it super deeply because we look at it from every possible angle. We crawl all over that thing. So that's more along the lines of what this symptom means for people with ADHD is not a restlessness so much as a hyperactive mind, which can manifest as restlessness. So getting to our subsymptoms, the first one we have here is rejection-sensitive dysphoria. And I mentioned this and the following subsymptom very briefly in the book, but this is an outsized reaction to negative stimuli which can play on our vulnerability and insecurities. It can contribute to anxiety, withdrawal, and depression. So this feeling is when we're hyper-focused on a negative feeling, usually of criticism of some kind, and I feel it like I want to disappear. I want to shrink. I want to withdraw myself from whatever the situation is because of those intense feelings. On the other side of that same on that same sort of symptom is oppositional defiant disorder. This is a reflexive reaction of anger and aggression toward authority or criticism. It can contribute to impulsive tantrums and violent outbursts. This is when you want to blow up at somebody. You want to put out so much angry energy that they'll just leave you alone. So it's related to rejection sensitive dysphoria, but kind of the opposite end of the emotional spectrum. The next subsymptom is time issues. The big thing to remember with our conception of time is we relate to it differently than neurotypicals do. We tend to have only have awareness of the present moment. There's this concept of tunnel vision, like you have a paper tube up over your eye and you're only able to see one point directly in front of you. Or if you've ever walked in the dark down a path, you're just staring at your feet to try to stay on the path, but you might walk off a cliff or run into a tree because you're not aware of anything else that's going on around you. You only are aware of now. Everything else is not now. And that doesn't really exist in a very deeply felt way for an atypical, the not now. And this contributes to a difficulty conceptualizing the future. And so we have difficulty setting things like deadlines or breaking a project up into several days going forward. We just say, well, I'm working on the project now. I might as well just work until it's finished. And that contributes to burnout. Oftentimes we fail, we get bored with it. It's just not ideal for finishing a lot of projects. So that's the big time issue that I see as a main subsymptom of some of those executive functions. And then the last subsymptom I wanted to mention is memory impairments. We tend not to make strong memories in the first place. Therefore, our past in our heads and our memories tend to become this kind of undifferentiated sort of blob. It's, kind of all this grayish purple color that's not that doesn't have a lot of nuance and a lot of detail. And that's because when we're making the memory, we're being inattentive to details in the present moment. Like right now, I'm looking at many different things around me, and I've got a sort of a subtext going on in my head of what I've got to do later, and what people think, and all of these things are happening, and I've got my own dialogue running in my head, and I'm trying to pay attention to all of it. So I'm not clearly focusing on details enough to make a strong memory in the first place. And this is also true of emotions. We tend to sort of take one emotion, and rather than see the nuance and remember the nuance from a situation, we kind of attribute one general overarching emotion to our memories. And this is difficult for recalling information because memories tend to be strongly tied to things like emotion and details. So it's important that we spend time to really focus on memories and make strong memories in the first place, or else these memory impairments are going to be chronic. That's just our natural state, is to be paying attention to a lot of things at once, and it does make it difficult to make strong memories. So now that we know a little bit more about what differentiates an atypical from a neurotypical, we can talk about why ADHD exists. And to be honest, this is kind of a mystery, but the short answer is nature. People are just different. ADHD is part of the human condition. Some people hypothesize that evolutionarily, people with ADHD are better suited to certain tasks, and our civilization just was built up to favor the way that neurotypicals do things. and therefore we need to adapt some of our behaviors in order to function better in a society that isn't really built perfectly suited to our needs. And people are just different. So you can find a lot of research about why ADHD is, but the basics that you need to know are it is hereditary and it is a lifelong condition. It's something that changes with age over time, but this course is not intended to solve the question of where does ADHD come from? Why is it? It's not something that's going to be cured or fixed. It's not a disease. It's a condition. It's naturally part of who you are, and it's fine. It has a lot of benefits too, as we'll discuss. And the last difference that I'd like to just mention between neurotypicals and atypicals before we move on is this concept of the mental structure. I think it's very helpful to visualize our mental structure as in contrast to neurotypicals as a pool versus a grid. So a neurotypical keeps the information in their mind in a grid structure. There's boxes for all the ideas, thoughts, emotions, all the stimuli that come into their brain. They put those things in a nice, organized framework, and everything is easy to access, it's labeled, and it exists in relation to other similar things. Atypicals like us, on the other hand, have a big pool of all the ideas and all the concepts that come into our brain. It is difficult it takes a lot of effort to find a particular piece of information. It takes us a while to dive in and find it in that big mix of stuff. Eventually we'll get there, and the benefit of the way that we think about things is we tend to relate ideas that most people would completely overlook any connection. Most people wouldn't synthesize information in the same way that atypicals are capable of, because we go on this journey to find the information. And it just so happens that my concept of a horse is right next to my concept of dentistry or whatever, and somehow I'll draw a parallel between those things, and that can give me an inspiration that could be useful for who knows what reason, but that's where inspiration comes from, is those peculiar connections that most people don't see, and that's one of the gifts of ADHD. But a lot of times there are problematic behaviors that we want to limit in our lives so that we can accomplish our goals. And this is what I call the cycle of distraction. So to move forward at a reasonable pace, you're going to need to control one aspect of this cycle so that you can continue to take actions that are well thought out and productive for whatever it is you're trying to do. What do I mean? So let's talk about what each of these terms are. First is external distractions. These are stimuli in your environment. It can be anything. Like I say, the smell of cookies. Now I've got a distraction and I'm thinking about cookie recipes. I'm thinking about what I want to put in my cookies. I'm thinking about memories of when my dad made cookies when I was a kid and it made me feel good. All kinds of stuff. So that's a distraction. So how can I limit that? Well, maybe I get an office that's not anywhere near my kitchen where I might have the smell of cookies around. Or maybe a better example is I get anxiety when I read the news. So maybe I make a rule that I limit the time that I spend reading the news, or I don't read it during the workday, or maybe I just avoid the news altogether. This is a way that I can sort of limit that external distraction that's causing me anxiety. The next one is internal distractions. These are our feelings and our thoughts. They tend to be kicked off from external distractions. This could be, let's say I just went through a hard breakup, and The feelings are starting to sap my energy. I need to start to find ways to control my feelings and my thoughts, and that is possible. There's several ways to do it. One way in this case might be to just talk to a close friend about what you're going through so that you can begin to regain control of those thoughts and feelings. The last one is behavior. Again, this is something that you can control. Atypicals tend to just act impulsively. There's a stimuli, a thought is generated or a feeling from that stimuli, and then immediately we tend to want to respond with an action. But if we can pause, this can be one of the most powerful tools that we can use to regulate our behavior. Pause and consider how your actions could contribute to a positive outcome rather than simply reacting impulsively, and you can break a chain of problematic behavioral patterns, these cycles that we're constantly running over and over again. If you can control just one link of this chain, then you can break or modify a problematic pattern. Okay, so now we need to talk about you, because that's the key variable in all of these symptoms and your reactions to your symptoms. So let's talk about where you are now and what is your condition. I find it useful to sort of externalize this so that I can be a little bit more objective. So I tend to think about myself, like my body and my my thoughts, as a boat. So one thing to remember about boats, so you can be compassionate with yourself, is every boat leaks. So you need to look for where the leaks are in your boat, but also try to find what are the strengths of this boat. What does it do well? What do you like about it? What objectively is great about it? Then also take a look at the comorbidities that you have. So besides ADHD, you have other issues that define your overall condition. What are those, and how do they affect the performance and navigational potential of your vessel? Next is your social group. Evaluate your social group. Are the people that you surround yourself with most often helping to lift you up? Can you be honest with them? Will they be honest with you? Do you trust them? This is the crew on your ship. These are the people who are actually going to help you sail towards your destination. They're going to be with you the whole time. So you need to surround yourself with the right people. It's very important. Finding them is difficult. Listening to them can be more difficult, but it's got to be done. And finally, direction. And this might be the most important of all. You need to have a clear destination in mind, an ultimate goal, because no matter whether you are navigating with intention or not, no matter where you think you're headed, or if you're not thinking about it, you will end up somewhere. You are headed somewhere. If your boat is sitting on the water, the waves are constantly pushing it, whether you are sailing in a certain direction or not. So you need to get all of those things sort of understood about yourself so that you can know where you are, so that it's possible to chart a course to where you want to go. Self-talk. So all of your speed towards your destination is going to be hindered or aided by your attitude. And that is really defined by how you talk to yourself about you and your condition. So I think it's important to remove certain words from our vocabulary or modify them so they're more compassionate. So for instance, I used to tell myself and even joke with other people when I wouldn't get a task done, it would always come up that I'm lazy. okay? That was tremendously hurtful to internalize that and believe it. And if you can do anything to avoid it, I highly recommend it, because you're not lazy, okay? There's a couple things going on. The big one is you're probably insecure, okay? You probably don't want to feel vulnerable, don't want to put yourself out there. Maybe the task is not even interesting to you and you just feel obligated to do it. But it's not laziness. Laziness is just the negative side of a two-sided coin here. It's really insecurity, and you can undermine your insecurity, overcome your insecurity by simply becoming curious, and about your desires. Figure out, how can I do this? How can I do it better? What's a different way? What is it? How can I make this unique? What are my questions about this thing? And suddenly you're not going to be lazy anymore, because you're going to be curious and excited about where your thoughts are headed. The next one on the list is should. You got to remove should from your life and switch it for want, because you're not going to do anything that you are told that you should do, that you feel obligated to do. That's really what should means. It's not that you should do something. It means external society made you feel obligated to do something that you do not want to do, that you wouldn't naturally do. And the more shoulds you have in your life, the more opportunities you're going to have to fail at something that you aren't able to engage with. The next one is stupid. You're not stupid. You're unfamiliar with something. Just take that right out of your vocabulary. People with ADHD aren't stupid. We just are unfamiliar with things. It takes a while to learn how to do things. That's just a natural part of trying something new or getting good at something. So you're unfamiliar. The next one is panic. I used to think that panic was a virtue. I used to think that if I was panicked and I sort of communicated that to people with my body language, then that would show them that I cared about what I was doing. But that is not what it's communicating. That's communicating that I'm disorganized, I'm unprepared, I'm rushing, I'm careless, and I'm very stressed out. And stress makes everything harder. It makes everything worse. Panic is never useful. Urgency, on the other hand, is useful. Urgency does communicate that you care about something, and it's necessary to move things forward in a timely fashion, to set deadlines and to hit those deadlines. That's urgency. So if you can internalize a sense of urgency without panic, that's what's going to be helpful for you to move forward as quickly as possible. Next is failure, related to stupidity. You're not a failure. You haven't failed. You're simply not there yet. So just keep trying. Those who don't give up will succeed. The next one is drugs. And this one comes up all the time around particularly stimulant medication like Adderall and Ritalin, and a lot of the medicine that atypicals are prescribed. We would not use a derisive, derogatory, sort of slanted term like drugs to describe inhalers for people with asthma, or crutches, or glasses, or any other kind of like medicine or prostheses or aid that people use when they simply have a condition that they're trying to navigate with. So your medicine is prescribed by a doctor. It works for you in a different way than it works for neurotypicals. Your brain chemistry and your brain structure is different. To you, this is medicine. It comes from a doctor. This is not a party habit. So don't talk about it like it's drugs, and don't tolerate anybody who's going to kind of throw that shade your way. And the last one is disorder. I know disorder is the last D in ADHD, so maybe it's kind of, it seems like, why would you have a problem with that? But I feel like disorder is sort of a negative way to think about what's going on with me. I'm not disordered. I'm not broken. I don't need to be fixed. I have a condition. And my condition is something that sometimes causes me to be a little bit disorderly in my organizational habits, for instance. But I'm not broken as such, and so I prefer the term condition. I think it's a little bit more compassionate. So now that we have positive self-talk going on, and we're thinking about how to treat ourselves with more compassion and in a more uplifting way, you might at this point, if you haven't already, be ready to go in for a diagnosis and talk to a real medical professional about what you're going through. Before you do this, I think it's really important to talk to maybe one or two people who are closest to you, who you can get good, honest feedback from. Honestly, the feedback isn't even the important part. It's just that they'll listen to what you're going through. They're not there for advice or really feedback even. They're just there to listen to what you're going through, to support you, and to make you feel good about yourself no matter what you're feeling. Because this is going to be a hard, a big change for you. There's a lot going on when you go in for an ADHD diagnosis. But again, it's got to be people who are very close to you. I wouldn't tell my boss. I wouldn't tell my children. I wouldn't tell my parents. I wouldn't tell my friends. I would tell my best friend and my wife. That's it. Those are the only people that I would consider telling. But it is important to have somebody there to talk about your feelings going into it, and also to help you do the difficult work in some capacity of finding the right medical professional and setting the appointment and keeping the appointment. And when you do that, when you do find the medical professional who you'll go to for your diagnosis, it's important that you find somebody who has ADHD experience. Even though this diagnosis is becoming much more common and better understood, there's still a lot of ignorance and prejudice and misconceptions, even in the medical community, about ADHD. So find somebody with experience and feel free to get a second opinion. A medical professional is going to be able to illuminate so much about what you're going through from a clinical perspective, from the actual medical science behind it. And they're also going to be able to diagnose some potential comorbidities that you might have. So for instance, things like depression and bipolar disorder can cause symptoms that are similar to ADHD. And you might also have those disorders or other disorders, and they all need to be treated separately. They all have their own treatment modalities, and your medical professional can help you sort of tease that apart and figure out what's the best course of action for each one of those. After your diagnosis is done, that's when you're really going to want somebody there to talk to, because you're going to be going through a lot of feelings, both positive and negative. You're probably going to have a lot going on inside of you emotionally. You'll probably go through a progression of many different emotions. Here's just a short list of some things you might be feeling. I definitely grieved. I was angry for what could have been if I would have known about my ADHD sooner in life. But luckily, I really latched onto the positive emotions, which was an overwhelming sense of relief and clarity about my condition and what I was actually going through. So much of my behavior now made a lot more sense to me. So it's important to have somebody who will just listen to you and be supportive as you go through those things. You're allowed to feel however you want to feel, and whatever it is, just know that it will pass, and that this is the moment, the perfect opportunity to start using that emotional energy to consider what kind of changes you want to make going forward. Okay, so going from the old you to the new you, where now you're taking your treatment into consideration, you're more intentional about the things that you want to achieve, and you're getting some more clarity about how to do that. Especially in the beginning, don't get discouraged by how slow the progress is. This is the work of a lifetime, and it's something that is not just exclusive to people with ADHD. We all go through big changes in our life, especially after moments of profound self-discovery. So just you're on the ride. Your past was not a mistake. Everything led you to this crossroads, to this milestone. You've been traveling all your life to get here, but now you are able to evaluate your path with intention and really take control of where you're going and how you get there. So remember this moment, and when you look back, you'll be able to see all of the progress that you've made since before you started making these changes. And that's really going to give you a positive boost, and it's those feelings that will really keep you moving forward. You'll be drawn forward by that internal sense of pride for everything that you've accomplished since the beginning of this journey. So the last thing before we move on from diagnosis is the question that most people will have when they find when they learn that you're diagnosed with ADHD is they're going to want to know, what does this mean for me? And you're going to have to be in that moment very clear with them, because when you disclose that you have ADHD to someone, really what you're doing is saying, give me special consideration in a specific way, because I operate best in this particular way. I need such and such in order to be at my best for whatever it is that we're working on. So I mostly recommend not disclosing, but in those times when you do need to disclose things because you need special considerations because of your symptoms, it's important that you're clear with that person and tell them what this means for them. Usually, for most people, it means nothing. And in that case, I wouldn't disclose your ADHD diagnosis. So, where am I headed? Well, you're starting with four main principles for your foundation. These four fundamental tools to help you understand where you are now and where you want to be in the future. So the first one is attitude. Always keep your attitude positive. It's something that you can control. It's one of the few things in life you can control. And yeah, it's important. The next one is vision. Where are you headed? You need to have an idea that gets you excited about moving forward and actually taking action. Next is your treatment team, the crew on your boat that we were talking about before, people that you can be honest with and who will be honest with you. And then the last one is therapy and coaching. These are professionals who you actually pay to help you with either your past trauma and emotional issues, or with your accountability and achieving concrete real-world goals. So those are the foundations that you can control, that are kind of fundamental tools in a way as we get started on our journey. So throughout the treatment, you're going to encounter challenges and setbacks. So it's important to have a system to be able to be resilient and regain focus on your objective. I highly recommend this process And it can be hard to remember 5 things, especially in the moment. But so let's just focus on number 1. Pause and breathe. Okay? Return to an awareness and sort of an objective observation of what you're feeling. Observe your circumstances and your reaction with equanimity. Don't judge what's going on. Just look at it. Pause. People with ADHD, we tend to be constantly going. Our thoughts are constantly going. It seems like things are always happening and we don't have a moment to just pause. But if you can give yourself permission to do that, that is what's going to relieve you of some of that pressure so that you can actually listen to what your inner self is asking for. Because whatever problem you're encountering, you know how to solve it. What's blocking you from solving it? Figure out what that is, and then it's easy to start thinking about, well, what could help me overcome that obstacle? And then you just have to go and do it. And it all starts with pausing and breathing. So that's the biggest takeaway from how to overcome challenges and setbacks and regain your focus when you encounter them. Okay, so getting back to the fuel that's going to push you forward and sort of your destination that's going to be the focus of the rest of your life. It's important to understand that each of us is headed to a unique destination, but we all use the same tools to get there, okay? There's many places to go, but we all use a compass, a map, whatever it is. Those don't change. So these tools that we'll talk about in the course are one of those navigational instruments that you can use, but it's up to you to determine what the destination is. And by destination, I'm really talking about your ideal future self. What is the coolest possible future self that you could imagine? When you think about that concept of you in the future, what are the accomplishments that this person has achieved that make them proud? And what big events needed to occur for them to become who they are? So what are those milestones? What are those achievements? What makes you feel proud when you look at that person and imagine being that person? That's how you're going to begin to chart your course. You're going to start by clearly visualizing your destination, your ideal future self, and then work backwards, setting milestones and just saying, okay, here are the sites, here are the landmarks along the way that this person passed until you get back to your present self, who you are today. Write that down. The more intention you put into something, writing it down, the more real it becomes. I often say it's not real until it's written or spoken or drawn. Putting more intention and more effort into those things that you want to manifest does make them more real and more possible. So definitely do that and focus on the feelings of pride that you will have when you become that ideal future self. The reason that imaginary future self appeals to you is because that person truly embodies and exemplifies your personal values. Those personal values determine the attributes that you admire in others and value in yourself. They're like the themes that define who you are. So in order to build that ideal future self, it's important to identify what those values are, what those themes are for you. So how do we do that? Well, there's a few ways that I think are helpful to get closer to identifying what your values are. First, examine your peak experiences. What are some things that made you feel really good? And what was it about that experience that really made it so important and so emotionally resonant for you? On the other hand, what are some negative experiences? For example, if there was a time when you had a really negative experience because something was unfair, maybe you can tease out from that one of your values is justice. Um, Another place to look for your values is in your own personal code of conduct. Once you have a list of values, maybe you have 10, 15, you can start to group these values together and identify the bigger themes that these values represent. And then start paring away until you get to your essential values. Which are the ones that really compose who you are as a person, the ones that you would never violate under any circumstances because that's just who you are. Try to get down to around 5, I think is a good number, and those are really your core values that make up who you are, and those are the going to be the sort of inexhaustible power source that will push you forward on this journey. One more tool that I think can be very useful for value discovery is the Ikigai. As it says on this wonderful image, Ikigai is a Japanese concept which means a reason for being. And if you fill in each of the segments of these circles, I think that you will also get a lot closer to understanding something about yourself and your values and what it is that's going to be important to you on your journey through life. As you begin to consider what changes you want to make in your life to bring you into alignment with those values and actually live those values, it will become obvious that a lot of familiar patterns in your life are difficult to change. Some patterns will be so familiar that you won't even recognize them as patterns. You'll just take them for granted as life. And this is your original unconscious programming. It's the system that you got that was installed in your brain throughout your childhood before you were able to really, before you had the ability to think about things in a more critical way. So you need to determine what you want your programming to be so that you can intentionally reprogram your patterns of thoughts, your emotions, and your behaviors. So you're always running a program. The choice is between running your unconscious programming that was installed in your childhood without your awareness, or actually running intentional programming which is built specifically for who you are as an adult, and it has the most potential of bringing you closer to your life goals. So we'll wrap up by just starting our treatment plan. And this first part I think of as the spiritual treatment plan because, again, this is who you are at the core of your being. This is like your soul. It's your mission statement. So start by defining your values. Your values are the fuel, the energy, which will drive you forward. Once you understand what your values are, you can start to think about what goals might manifest those values. What actions would I want to take in the world because these are things I believe in? And that's sort of like your map. There's many different goals, milestones, sights to see on the map, and you're not necessarily going to visit every one, but they're on your map because they relate to your values. They're places that you might want to go, that you could see yourself going to. And then finally, what is your true ultimate destination? Where do you want to mark on the map? That is your ideal future self. And then once you have that destination picked out, you can go back to your map and say, okay, here's the things that I'll pass. Here's the goals that will get me to that specific destination. And then you can start working toward that proactively. So fill those things out, and let's talk a little bit about ADHD basics. Let's get some questions on the table. I'm ready to hear from you guys, whether you have questions on ADHD basics or anything else that's on your mind. Just go ahead and pop those in the chat. But we'll start off probably with some emailed questions, and yeah, we'll go for as long as we can. What do you got?